2 robbers, dozens of cops, a shootout that turned a normal day into a deadly war zone. But what made this robbery so dangerous is that these criminals were ready for anything, and they were willing to die to get away. What happened next will shock you. On February 28, 1997, 2 heavily armed criminals walked into the North Hollywood Bank, expecting an easy heist. But what followed was anything but easy. Within minutes, a normal robbery turned into an all-out war zone. With the criminals outgunned and determined to escape at any cost, the police found themselves in a fight for survival. What started as a simple robbery spiraled into a deadly 44-minute shootout, with bullets flying through the streets and innocent lives hanging in the balance. In this video, we'll dive deep into the shocking truth behind the robbery, the heroic efforts of the police, the chaos that ensued, and how this event changed law enforcement's approach to armed crime. Stay tuned as we uncover the untold details of the North Hollywood Bank robbery. February 28, 1997. It was a crisp, sunny morning in North Hollywood, Los Angeles. The city was buzzing with its usual activity, cars rushing by, people getting to work, and shops opening for business. But in one of the busiest parts of this vibrant city, the North Hollywood branch of the Bank of America sat unsuspectingly in the middle of a crime that would change everything. For the average customer, it was just another day. Some were here to cash checks, others to make deposits, and a few to simply withdraw some money. There was nothing out of the ordinary until 2 men walked through the doors of the bank, and everything turned upside down. These men weren't ordinary criminals. Larry Phillips Jr. and Emil Matasareanu weren't your typical bank robbers. Phillips, in his early 30s, was deeply involved in studying military tactics, weaponry, and combat strategies. His obsession with firearms and his meticulous planning made him a deadly adversary. Matasareanu, his accomplice, was a skilled gunman who had been involved in criminal activities for years. He was no stranger to violent crimes and had a history of evading law enforcement. Together, they were a perfect storm of lethal ambition. Both men were wearing full body armor, a rarity for robbers at the time, along with helmets and gloves. They carried military-grade weapons, AK-47 assault rifles and AR-15s, with hundreds of rounds of ammunition. Their plan wasn't to simply rob the bank, they were prepared for war. The duo walked in, calmly positioning themselves at the front of the bank. Their cold eyes surveyed the layout. No one could have anticipated how quickly this robbery would escalate. Phillips shouted, "Everybody get down!" Now, the usual sounds of cash registers, chatter, and the rustling of papers were drowned out by the echo of chaos. The 2 men moved swiftly, securing the hostages. They weren't panicking, they had done their homework. The robbers knew that they needed control. Phillips and Matasareanu took command, ordering everyone to the ground. It became clear that this wasn't a robbery of opportunity. It was planned with deadly precision. At that very moment, the Los Angeles Police Department, LAPD, was being notified of the robbery. The bank's alarm had been triggered and units were on their way. However, the first officers on the scene would find themselves completely unprepared for what they would face. As soon as the police arrived, the scene at the bank turned into an all-out battle. The first officers on the scene were completely unprepared for what they were about to face. The robbers weren't just trying to escape, they were ready for a fight. Armed with high-powered assault rifles, body armor, and full military gear, Phillips and Matasareanu were far more dangerous than any of the officers could have imagined. At first, the police thought they could control the situation, but that quickly proved to be a deadly mistake. The robbers opened fire the moment the officers got close. Bullets flew through the air, shattering windows and hitting parked cars. The street outside the bank became a war zone as officers dove for cover and returned fire. Officer response. The police had to think quickly. They called in backup, but they were facing a situation unlike anything they had ever dealt with. The criminals were outgunned, and the officers soon realized that they couldn't just use their usual weapons to win this fight. The robbers' body armor made it nearly impossible to stop them with standard police firearms. The LAPD realized they needed heavier firepower if they were going to take these men down. In what felt like an eternity, officers scrambled to get more specialized weapons. The response time for extra ammunition and gear seemed slow, and the officers outside the bank were left vulnerable. The robbers took advantage of the chaos, using the bank structure to their advantage. They were able to keep firing while staying hidden behind pillars and vaults. Inside the bank, the hostages were terrified. Many were hiding under desks or behind counters, praying they wouldn't become targets in the crossfire. But the robbers didn't care. They were fully focused on escaping, no matter the cost. They moved swiftly, directing hostages out of the way and keeping an eye on the windows to track the police's every move. By the time backup arrived, the shootout was in full swing. For the next 44 minutes, the streets outside the bank were a deadly battlefield. The criminals had assault rifles, and their military-grade body armor made them nearly impossible to take down. The LAPD officers, armed with only handguns and shotguns, found themselves outmatched in every way. The robbers weren't just trying to escape anymore, they were determined to win this fight. They didn't hesitate to fire indiscriminately, targeting police officers and anything that moved. The police returned fire, but the criminals' armor made them nearly invincible to regular bullets. In this deadly exchange, the criminals shot at everything, including police vehicles and anything in their path. Desperate measures. As the shootout continued, the police realized that they needed a different strategy to stop these robbers. They began to rely on the surrounding environment to trap the criminals. Officers attempted to block off streets and create a perimeter around the bank to prevent any potential escape routes. However, the robbers were far too skilled. They maneuvered around the area like they had been trained for situations like this, often shooting from behind cover and moving quickly. The public was also in danger. As bullets flew, innocent civilians had to take cover wherever they could. Some were caught in the middle of the crossfire, while others were stuck in their cars, unable to drive away because the streets were so dangerous. The whole area was a nightmare, with the sound of gunfire echoing through the streets and helicopters overhead. At one point, one of the robbers, Matasareanu, was hit. He was severely wounded, but continued to fight. Despite being injured, he didn't stop shooting. Meanwhile, Phillips was still holding his ground, fighting off any attempts by the police to move in closer. But the tide began to turn. Specialized units from the LAPD, equipped with heavier weapons, arrived. They brought in rifles and armored vehicles that could withstand the intense gunfire. Slowly but surely, the police started to gain the upper hand. As the battle raged on, the robbers' chances of escape grew slimmer. The LAPD's SWAT teams and heavily armored vehicles began to surround the North Hollywood Bank. They had a clear strategy now to move in slowly and carefully, ensuring the robbers couldn't escape or continue firing without facing overwhelming force. Matasareanu was the first to be knocked down. He had been wounded earlier, but continued fighting with the same intensity. The gunfire, though, started to take its toll. Eventually, one final bullet brought him to the ground, ending his reign of terror. But even then, the danger wasn't over. Phillips, the second robber, was still going strong, and he wasn't ready to give up without a fight. Phillips knew the situation was dire, but he refused to surrender. With no way out, he decided to make one last stand. He moved toward the front of the bank, trying to engage the officers in a final desperate bid to break free. But the police weren't about to give him a chance. Helicopters circled above, giving the officers a bird's-eye view of Phillips' position. The SWAT team and officers on the ground coordinated their attack, using all their training and resources to corner him. Phillips tried to move, but it was too late. As he attempted to break cover, a final exchange of gunfire rang out. The end of the standoff. Phillips was shot and fell to the ground, no longer able to continue the fight. The police had won, but at a heavy cost. Both robbers were dead, but the damage they caused was felt in every corner of the city. The aftermath was chaotic. The streets around the bank were littered with bullet casings, damaged vehicles, and the lasting signs of the massive firefight that had just occurred. It was a miracle that more people hadn't been killed. A new era in law enforcement. In the wake of the robbery, the LAPD and other law enforcement agencies realized something crucial. They weren't prepared for an attack like this. The heavily armed robbers had changed everything. Police departments across the country began rethinking their response to armed criminals, realizing they needed more than just handguns and shotguns to handle these kinds of situations. New protocols and equipment, like assault rifles, bulletproof vests, and armored vehicles, became standard issue. This robbery had marked a turning point for law enforcement tactics. It wasn't just about catching criminals. It was about surviving and protecting civilians in the face of ever-growing threats. The dust was still settling after the chaos, but the full weight of what had happened started to sink in. The North Hollywood bank robbery wasn't just another crime. It was a wake-up call that changed how law enforcement in America would respond to armed robberies and dangerous criminals. As the bodies of the two robbers were taken from the scene, the scale of the damage became clear. The police officers involved, many of whom had never faced such a heavily armed threat, were left with a mix of shock, relief, and disbelief. They had faced down an extreme situation, and it took everything in their training and resources to come out on top. But what about the community? The civilians who had been caught in the middle of this deadly shootout were traumatized. Local businesses had suffered from the gunfire, and the bank's employees were left shaken, forever changed by the violence they had witnessed. For them, it was not just a robbery. It was an experience that left scars much deeper than the ones left by the bullets. And the police? While they had technically won by stopping the robbers, the victory came at a cost. The public perception of police effectiveness had been shaken. How could two criminals, armed to the teeth, almost get away with a crime so brazen and dangerous? This question lingered in the minds of both the public and law enforcement alike. As police began to investigate the robbery, they uncovered even more shocking details. The robbers were not just criminals, they were a part of a larger network. Their firearms weren't just any guns. They were military-grade weapons that most civilians or even police officers would never encounter. The robbers had meticulously planned out their heist, gathering intelligence on the bank, its routines, and security systems. What shocked law enforcement the most was the realization that the robbers had been preparing for this moment for months. They didn't just stumble upon the bank, they had chosen it strategically, knowing that it would be one of the most difficult heists to pull off, but also one of the most lucrative. Their military-grade armor and weaponry weren't just for intimidation. They were prepared for a serious fight, expecting exactly what happened. This revelation changed everything. The robbery wasn't just a crime, it was an attack on the very system of law enforcement itself, and it was a sign that the criminal landscape was evolving in ways that police weren't ready for. The aftermath of the North Hollywood bank robbery didn't just change the lives of those directly involved, it also changed law enforcement protocols forever. Police around the country were forced to rethink how they handled armed robberies and violent criminals. The events of that day were a turning point in how law enforcement would approach high-risk situations. In the days and weeks following the robbery, police departments all across the United States started to reevaluate their training and equipment. The biggest question they were asking was, what if something like this happens again? And the answer was clear. They needed to be better prepared. One of the most significant changes was the increase in specialized police units. Prior to the North Hollywood robbery, police forces didn't have the kind of heavily armed response teams that could face criminals armed with military-style weapons. The robbery made it clear that, in certain situations, regular officers with standard-issue pistols and shotguns were no match for criminals with assault rifles and body armor. This led to the creation of SWAT, Special Weapons and Tactics teams that were better equipped to handle these types of situations. Police forces began investing in heavily armored vehicles, assault rifles, and body armor, the same types of equipment the robbers had used. These specialized units were trained to handle high-risk situations, and they became a key part of law enforcement strategy. But the North Hollywood robbery also sparked a national conversation about police tactics and training. Many criticized how unprepared the officers were that day, but others praised the bravery and resourcefulness of those on the front lines. Despite being outgunned, they managed to stop the robbers, and their actions saved countless lives. As police departments across the country began to make changes, the North Hollywood shootout became a case study in police training. New protocols were developed to ensure that officers could handle situations like this with a higher level of preparedness. Police forces now had to train for the worst-case scenarios, criminals armed with military-style weapons, willing to fight to the death. The robbery also sparked a shift in how police viewed the relationship between criminals and weapons. It wasn't just about stopping the bad guys anymore, It was about making sure officers could survive in the increasingly dangerous world of armed crime. Police began to understand that they had to take a more proactive approach to preparing for these kinds of encounters. They couldn't just rely on standard tactics or hope that criminals wouldn't have access to high-powered weapons. The North Hollywood robbery showed them that they needed to be prepared for anything. When the gunfire finally stopped, the North Hollywood bank robbery was officially over. But what happened after the dust settled had a lasting impact on law enforcement and the public. The events of that day were so extreme, they forced changes in how police prepared for armed criminals and how they responded to such dangerous situations in the future. After both robbers, Phillips and Matasareanu, were taken down, the police immediately turned their attention to the survivors. Matasareanu was pronounced dead at the scene, while Phillips was rushed to the hospital, but he too died from his injuries shortly after. Their bodies became part of the ongoing investigation. Authorities quickly discovered that the robbers had not only been heavily armed, but they were also wearing high-level body armor that was almost impossible for standard police weapons to penetrate. The violence and scale of the robbery left the public in shock. What had been a regular morning in North Hollywood suddenly turned into a battle zone. The media covered every aspect of the robbery, showing images of the police vehicles, the barricades, and even footage of the robbers firing their weapon. News outlets around the world were quick to share updates, and the event quickly became one of the most talked-about crimes in U.S. history. In the aftermath, law enforcement agencies across the nation realized they were unprepared for the level of firepower the robbers had used. The North Hollywood shootout exposed a major gap in police resources. At that time, police officers were generally equipped with pistols or shotguns, which were no match for the robbers' assault rifles. This forced many police departments to rethink their tactical strategies and weaponry. The LAPD, in particular, took immediate action. They recognized that they needed heavily armored vehicles, assault rifles, and specialized training to handle such high-risk situations in the future. This led to the creation of SWAT teams with more advanced weaponry and armor. The shootout pushed the LAPD to develop a better response system for dealing with heavily armed criminals. In the years following the robbery, the LAPD implemented new protocols for responding to situations involving armed criminals. Officers were given access to more powerful weapons, and the concept of SWAT became central to police operations in high-risk cases. Other police departments across the country soon followed suit, adopting similar strategies to better equip their officers for confrontations with armed criminals. The shootout also left a lasting mark on how the public viewed crime and law enforcement. For many, it was a wake-up call. People realized that criminals weren't just robbing banks, they were preparing for war. The fear of armed criminals with military-grade weapons became a real concern, and it changed how people saw safety in their communities. The media coverage contributed to this by continuously showing how dangerous this new breed of criminals could be. The robbery didn't just change the way police handled similar crimes, it also led to major changes in police training. Officers began training for worst-case scenarios, learning to deal with highly dangerous, heavily armed criminals. Police forces across the U.S. became more proactive in preparing for situations where military-style weapons were involved. This robbery ended with a lasting impact on law enforcement. After the intense shootout and the tragic end for the two criminals, the police learned valuable lessons about being ready for the unexpected. The robbery showed that law enforcement needed to upgrade their tactics, weapons, and training for situations like this. The police realized that they were not fully prepared for an armed confrontation on this scale. As a result, they improved their training, especially for SWAT teams, who received better equipment and specialized practice. This made the police much more capable of handling future armed threats, making streets safer for both officers and civilians. The media also had a big role to play. The live broadcasts of the shootout brought national attention to the event. It was a reminder that media coverage during such intense situations needs to be careful and responsible, as it could affect how the public viewed the police and the criminals involved. The two robbers, Larry Phillips Jr. and Emil Matasareanu, ended their violent attempt with tragic death. Phillips took his own life, and Matasareanu died from the injuries he sustained during the shootout. Their attempt to escape with millions ended in failure, but it left a lasting change in how police prepare for dangerous situations. The North Hollywood robbery was not just about two criminals trying to steal money. It showed how the world of law enforcement and media needed to change. This event marked a significant shift in police preparedness and media responsibility, both of which continue to shape how we handle such extreme situations today. But what do you think? Was there another way this could have been handled? Could the outcome have been different if the police were better prepared? Or was this inevitable? Share your thoughts in the comments below and let's discuss.